Hey everyone, it's episode 59, almost 60 soon. Well, in Colombia, no dar papaya literally means don't give papaya, which means pretty much avoid needless danger and don't make yourself an easy target. They also say ponerle pecho a las balas, to put your chest to the bullets. So I guess the truth is somewhere in between, right? In complete avoidance of a dangerous situation and being extremely brave. But Colombians are brave, and in Mexico they say there is no worse fight than the one not fought, and Mexico is appropriate to highlight because several Mexicans fought in Ukraine's Latin units, if I might call them that way. Remember a friendship, what is it? Remember, Friendship, Navigation, and Commerce Pact between the Austrian Empire and Mexico was signed in 1842, and in 1864, French troops led by Napoleon III installed Maximilian, the brother of Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph I, as Emperor of Mexico. Thomas Murphy de Alegria was named Mexico's ambassador to Austria-Hungary by him, and Lviv and western Ukraine were once Austria-Hungary. But that is a totally different story for some other time. When you think of Colombia, what usually comes to your mind is Inca Empire, extraordinary, Café Tinto, cocaine trade, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Shakira, of course, but not necessarily in that particular order. For us, who don't have personal experience of the country, the perception is, of course, limited to cliches and stereotypes about the region. I have a decent amount of Colombian friends and colleagues, and I know them as warm, fun-loving people. For me, Colombians, as well as their nearest regional neighbors, remember it was all Gran Colombia once, are extraordinary people who will share everything with you, although they themselves might don't have much at all. And they also possess great esprit de corps, which, if you have watched anything filmed with GoPro on their helmets on Telegram channels, is often manifested in mutual prayer before they start storming Muscovite trenches. It is touching to see these brave people in their humbleness. So yes, the big thing, or the big kahuna in Colombian history was, of course, Simón Bolívar, who was born in Caracas on July 24, 1783, when Venezuela, remember, was still a part of the Spanish Empire. So his nationality and cultural identity were rooted in Venezuela, even though he was president of Gran Colombia, a federation that included modern-day Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, and Ecuador. And he was instrumental in the liberation of several South American countries, including Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. He was a key player in the struggle for South American independence from Spanish authority and was known as El Libertador, I'm sorry. So the liberator. And Bolivar, the son of a wealthy Venezuelan aristocracy, was educated in Europe, where he was exposed to Enlightenment concepts that shaped his political beliefs. The Venezuelan War of Independence in 1810 marked the start of Bolivar's military career. He was instrumental in the liberation of multiple nations. And despite being forced into exile when the First Republic was overthrown by the Spanish in 1814, Bolivar played a significant role in the early independence movements. He overcame the Spanish and gained independence in 1819 by leading a bold campaign over the Andes. Antonio Sucre was instrumental in Ecuador's 1822 independence. In 1824, Bolivar freed Peru by finishing the work of José de San Martin, and in 1825, Upper Peru was freed and the nation was renamed after Bolivar. In addition to Peru, in between 1823 and 1829, and Gran Colombia in between 1819 and 1830, Bolivar was briefly the first president of Bolivia in 1825. All that was a shape of things to come in many ways. Today, well, sure enough, Brazilians are the largest group from this region in French Foreign Legion. For instance, almost 14% But when you think that Brazil's estimated population is 212 million people, which is 4 times more than 53 million in Colombia, whose 750 Colombians currently serve in the Legion, which makes 10% of the French Foreign Legion in total. And this established community likely facilitates recruitment by providing a network of support and familiarity for new recruits. And I cannot stop thinking about Colombian volunteers as in a way like as condottieri. Anyways, history of mercenaries, mercenarios in there was like pre-Cold War Colombian volunteer forces. Think about it. It was war. There was a war of independence, 1810 to 1819, and the Ejército de los Comuneros, or Army of the Commoners, composed of peasants and militias, fought against Spanish rule. Figures like Simón Bolívar and Francisco de Paula Santander led these volunteer forces. Post-independence, Colombia maintained a small standing army but relied heavily on regional militias during 19th century civil wars. Colombia-Peru War in between 1932 and 1933. Well, volunteers and regular troops retook Leticia from Peruvian forces in a conflict that sparked nationalist fervor, and the Colombian Expeditionary Force included ad hoc volunteer unit. The conflict arose from a territorial dispute over the Leticia Trapezium, or a strategic Amazonian region transferred from Peru to Colombia under the 1922 Salomon-Lozano Treaty. Peruvian nationalists opposing the treaty seized Leticia on September 1st, 1932, expelling Colombian authorities. And conflicts resulted from Colombia's mobilization of troops to recapture the region under President Enrique Olaya Herrera. Leticia was overrun by Peruvian soldiers and citizens, therefore Colombia sent a military expedition across Brazil. Early in 1933, Colombian troops retook Tarapacá and the Peruvian fort at Guepi. Tensions were somehow reduced in April of 1933 when Peruvian President Luis Sanchez Cerro was assassinated. In June of 1934, Peru returned Leticia to Colombia through the League of Nations. Although the war cemented the lines of the 1922 treaty, Leticia was left economically isolated and subsequently turned into a center for illegal trade. The dispute brought to light the difficulties of upholding territorial agreements in isolated areas of the Amazon. The jungle terrain caused logistical challenges for both sides, and there was actually no clear military triumph. Colombian mercenaries were not a major force in the Colombia-Peru War. Rather, Colombia depended on its conventional military, which was strengthened by tactical and logistical innovations. And these included the Air Force's improvisation employing commercial aircrafts from Scata, a German Colombian airline that eventually changed its name to Avianca, and we all know Avianca. Remember that the advertising. Okay, never mind. I'm not going to go there. Anyways, so let's move on. And now we're moving on. Where else but to the Korean War, which, as you know, lasted from 1951 to 1953. And this is where things start to get interesting, since Colombians had been battling North Koreans before, even before the war in Ukraine. In actuality, this is the second time that Colombians and North Koreans have engaged in combat. And being the only country in Latin America to provide combat soldiers to the UN coalition during the Korean War, Colombia played a special and much disregarded role. With more than 5,000 soldiers spread across 4 rotations, the Batallón Colombia, or Colombian Battalion, served under American command, mainly the 7th Infantry Division. They participated in pivotal conflicts such as Old Boldly and Operation Barbula, both, where they sustained significant losses but were awarded a U.S. Presidential Unit Citation for their bravery. They had 38 missing in combat and almost 450 injured. And during the Battle of Old Boldly, the 3rd Battalion lost. The 3rd Battalion alone lost 313 soldiers in 10 days. And also with 700 sailors on board, 3 frigates, RC Almirante Padilla, RC Capitan Tono, and Almirante Brion patrolled the waters of Korea. And just a brief note that Almirante Brion was named after military officer Felipe Luis Brion de Tro, who was born in Curaçao on July 6, 1782, and died there on September 27, 1821. He participated in the Venezuelan War of Independence, and in the Navy of the former Republic of Colombia and Venezuela, he attained the rank of admiral. He was the son of Marie de Tro, a Belgian, and Pierre-Louis Brion, a trader. After arriving in Curaçao in 1777, they sent their son to the Netherlands to finish his schooling in 1794. He then joined the Batavian Republic's armed forces there to combat the British invasion of the northern Netherlands. He took part in the Castrico and Bergen fights. After being captured by the British, he was soon released. But back to Korea. So, President Laureano Gomez aimed to respect UN collective security principles and improve relations with the United States. Colombia's military was professionalized by the war, and its veterans went on to spearhead counterinsurgency operation at home. Outside of peacekeeping missions, it continues to be Colombia's sole overseas combat commitment. South Korean and American awards, such as the ROK Presidential Unit Citation and the Legion of Merit, were awarded to Colombian forces. Colombia's Independence Day procession honors surviving veterans every year in Bogota. Despite being little in comparison to other superpowers, Colombia's involvement in the Cold War showed its commitment to the world and had a long-lasting impact on its military character. So now you might understand why there are so many. At the beginning I was really surprised. How come there are so many Colombians like in Ukraine, right? So, anyways, under UN leadership, more than 1,000 volunteer battalion Colombia battled. They were motivated by anti-communism sentiment and assurances of U.S. assistance and training, and many were veterans of Colombia's internal battles. The foundation for subsequent Cold War counterinsurgency strategies was established by this deployment. So, let me explain more about Colombian volunteers and irregular forces to help you better comprehend the situation. Volunteer militias were frequently organized by liberal and conservative factions in the so-called 19th century civil wars, and this practice continued into the 20th century. Later, paramilitary organizations were foreshadowed by the emergence of partisan militias and paramilitary groups during La Violencia in between 1948 and 1958, some of which were state-sanctioned. And by fusing professional military development with ideological motivations, pre-Cold War volunteers established the groundwork for Colombia's subsequent deployment of regular forces and overseas deployment. Reports on the number of Colombian volunteers fighting in Ukraine vary. Estimates range from a few hundred to more than 2,000 at the height of the conflict. Although Ukrainian soldiers thought the real number was closer to a few hundred, some accounts claim that anything in between 1,000 and 2,000 Colombians were serving during the peak of recruitment. Only tiny groups remained after the majority of the first Colombian volunteers had departed after their 6-month contracts ended in early 2025. Volunteers gave 3 main motivations for joining: professional military experience, financial incentives, which was anything in between $3,000 to $4,000 US per month, and ideological support for Ukraine. There have been at least 80 Colombian fighters slain, and according to some of the sources I follow, the actual figure was regrettably far higher. Because of the severity of the war, the others had to leave early. I'm aware of the specifics, but I'll exclude them from this episode. Some were even allegedly arrested in Venezuela and transported to Russia. Also, there is no proof that Colombians are volunteering to fight for Russia in the conflict in Ukraine. Even while it might not be definitive evidence, it provides a broad overview for those with a malicious purpose of who wish to demonstrate that Colombia's interest in Ukraine's armed forces is purely financial rather than ideological. That doesn't change the reality, though, that Colombian fighters driven solely by financial gain have been observed in other conflict zones. Colombian mercenaries have grown to be a major force in international conflicts because to a mix of their tremendous military expertise, economic difficulties, and the demand for their combat skills around the world. Also, what happened before, in addition to U.S. military training under Plan Colombia, Colombia's long-running domestic struggles against guerrilla groups like FARC and ELN have produced a pool of highly experienced veterans. And these soldiers, who are skilled in counter-insurgency and jungle warfare, frequently receive poor pay and insufficient veteran care at home, which leads many of them to look for higher-paying jobs elsewhere. In order to fight drug cartels and rebel organizations like the FARC in Colombia, the United States developed Plan Colombia in 2000 as a military, economic, and counter-narcotics endeavor. It was created in 1999 by U.S. President Bill Clinton and Colombian President Andres Pastrana with the goals of reducing coca production through fumigation and alternative development initiatives, as well as ending Colombia's armed conflict by bolstering military and police forces. Although the final U.S.-approved plan gave military aid precedence over social expenditures, it was also intended to encourage peace negotiations with the FARC. Over a 12-year period, the U.S. contribution increased from $1.3 billion to about $8 billion, making Colombia the largest beneficiary of U.S. military assistance in Latin America. Only 30% of that went toward economic development, judicial reform, and human rights issues, while the majority, 70% or more, went into the military and police for helicopters, training, and intelligence purposes. The FARC eventually saw a sharp reduction in power, which paved the way for peace negotiations between 2012 and 2016. And according to U.S. sources, coca production fell by 72% between 2001 and 2012. However, UN data indicates that the impact was negligible over the long run. Of course, everything has drawbacks, and excessive militarization has resulted in violations of human rights, including extrajudicial executions by American trained forces. Additionally, rural areas suffered from aerial fumigation and social services received inadequate funding. And all of that culminated in the 2016 Peace Colombia, or quote mark Tratado de Paz, which was written after the FARC peace agreement and shifted the emphasis to rural development and reintegration. All of that, despite its mixed outcomes, served as a model for U.S. drug and counterinsurgency tactics in Central America. Although Plan Colombia militaristic strategy is still contested, it is recognized for having decreased insurgent violence and changed the dynamics between the United States and Colombia. And today, mercenaries from Colombia operate in a variety of conflict areas. Colombians have been widely used by the United Arab Emirates for combat and security positions, including deployment in Yemen's civil war. Their cost effectiveness in comparison to Western contractors make them valuable. More than 300 Colombian mercenaries have joined the Rapid Support Forces, which are supported by the UAE, United Arab Emirates, in the civil conflict in Sudan. According to reports, some people were tricked into enrolling under false pretenses, thinking they would be working on the security of oil infrastructure. But no. Colombia fighters have demonstrated their worldwide reach by seeing in cartel wars in Mexico and Ukraine. There's a lot of financial appeal, for sure. Colombian soldiers receive $460 a month at home, but mercenary work overseas can pay up to almost $2,600 plus more for frontline fighting. Ethical concerns have been raised by the participation of Colombian mercenaries. They allegedly took part in urban fighting in El Fasher, Sudan, where the RSF accused them of war crimes. Some were tricked into enlisting under false pretenses, and they had to deal with hazardous circumstances like drone attacks and ambushes. The rise of Colombia as a major supplier of mercenaries emphasizes how military prowess and economic hardship meet in contemporary conflict. Former members of Colombia's National Army and National Police make up the majority of the Colombian volunteers fighting for Ukraine. Many of them have fought, as I have said, in counterinsurgency campaigns against organizations like the FARC and drug gangs. Colombian soldiers are highly adaptive to the front lines of Ukraine since they have received training in asymmetric warfare. Veterans of Colombia protracted internal battles contribute their knowledge of small unit tactics, urban combat, and jungle warfare. Many served in elite forces such as Batallón de Infantería and Brigada de Fuerzas Especiales. For their tactical abilities, the National Police or Policía Nacional, former Gaula or Anti-Kidnapping Extortion Unit, and Jungla Commandos, I don't know, I think it's Jungla, counter-narcotics. They are all highly regarded, and their background in irregular warfare fits very well with Ukraine's use of trench warfare and drones. Using their fighting expertise overseas, several recruits have previously worked for private military corporations in the Middle East. I highly recommend watching Distrito Salvaje on Netflix if you want to delve into the complexities of Colombian politics while also learning Spanish and enjoying a fantastic political thriller. Okay, so let's say a word or two about the equipment. The Colombian police and military employ a combination of U.S. machine guns, Israeli-made rifles, NATO standard small arms, and indigenously made firearms. Because of past relationships, operational preferences, and geopolitical considerations, they mainly rely on weaponry manufactured in Israel, the United States, and Europe rather than Brazil. The U.S. gave billions of dollars in military aid, including M16 rifles, M60 machine guns, and Black Hawk helicopters as part of Plan Colombia. This is why, additionally, Colombia embraced Israeli drones, which are preferred for counterinsurgency and jungle combat, and Galil ace guns, which are licensed local production. While Colombia prioritizes NATO-compatible weapons for interoperability with U.S. allies, Brazil's arms sector, which produces Taurus pistols and IMBEL rifles, focuses more on domestic use or niche exports such as police forces in Africa and elsewhere. Additionally, the Galil Ace's combat-proven reputation in Colombian conflicts has not been matched by other weapons in Brazilian forces such as the IA-2 rifle, which was supposed to replace Fusil Automatique Léger, or what we know as FAL. I'm not sure why, but because it shares certain similarities with the FAL. But that's just another story, another chapter. Well, Brazil's heavier IA-2 or Astros missile systems are not appropriate for Colombia's combat. Instead, lightweight, robust weapons and UAVs are needed. Additionally, cops favor Barretts, MP5s, and Uzis. So aside of that, what else do Colombians have? Okay, however, M16 and M4 carbines are still using sparingly, especially by special forces, most likely for logistical reasons. Rural police and counter-guerrilla groups known as Jungla Commandos use the AK-103 or an AK-47, right? Well, I guess it's because the FARC people, the FARC guys, they had the same, so I guess it's easier. Anyways. Also, as I have said, M60 E6 machine guns are widely used, and Colombia is purchasing 460 of them to replace its aging FN MAGs. Infantry units use the older generation M249 SAW and for suppressive fire. So it's mostly EMI uses and micro uses, which are highly favored by police and counter-narcotics squad. And as I have said, the Gaula or anti-kidnapping unit is particularly fond of them. For breaching and riot control, the Police Special Operations Group or POLFA uses regular shotguns such as the Remington 870 and Mossberg 500 and the HK MP5 9mm. Naturally, sniper teams are equipped with a highly unique weapon, the formidable Barrett M82 I think that's a 50 caliber, yes, to combat drug cartel armor. So Colombia's mix of NATO and Soviet-era weapons reflects its counterinsurgency needs, though corruption remains a major issue in arms management. So the reality is, I believe that Colombian volunteers in Ukraine are likewise armed with a logistical nightmare consisting of a combination of conventional equipment provided by Ukraine and customized gear that capitalizes on their experience in counterinsurgency and jungle warfare. So below is the summary of their usual loadout. PKM machine guns, AK-74 rifles, and weaponry given by the West, such as the FN SCAR, which is a great gun, or M4 carbines, PKM machine guns, I said AK-74. Yeah, so it's a mix. Also, there's a lot of I'm pretty sure you have noticed widely used Checkmate CZ Brand 2, both in 5.56 and 70.62 caliber, and as well as the Croatian-made VHS-2 in 5.56 are both very popular and widely utilized. Although there is no official confirmation regarding Colombian forces specifically, NATO has been observed alongside Ukrainian Foreign Legion fighters, especially those who have received NATO training. They use level 4 ceramic plates and helmets, as well as contemporary NATO or Soviet-era counterparts like the PASGT and FPV drones for attacks and reconnaissance, which some Colombians think are adapted from cartel combat methods. Colombians often struggle with Ukraine's climate, requiring extra cold weather equipment, which is curious considering that they have the same historical experience with Korean War. Also, there is a mismatch between NATO Warsaw Pact calibers, forced reliance on Ukrainian supply chains. Colombia's effectiveness stems from blending their irregular warfare expertise with Ukrainian firepower, through attrition remains high due to drone threats and trench assaults. They employ foreign equipment and Ukrainian radios, although hand signals or phone interpreters are frequently required due to linguistic problems. I cannot. Well, if they have a problem, can you imagine what's going on with North Koreans in on the Russian side? That's insane. Because Colombian veterans frequently have medical experience from counter-narcotics operations, they require lightweight mobility equipment such as enhanced trauma kits, improvised camouflage, and ghillie suits. Naturally, some bring night vision goggles or privately purchased NVGs, which are uncommon in Ukrainian units. I wouldn't say uncommon, maybe not as... I don't know. You don't see them every day, right? So a little bit about the Colombian engagements. It was, of course, Battle of Bakhmut from 2022 to 23. Colombian fighters joined Ukrainian units during the brutal attrition warfare in Bakhmut, where their jungle warfare skills were adapted to urban combat, and reports highlight their effectiveness in small unit tactics, but also high attrition rates. In Kherson counteroffensive in 2022, some Colombians were attached to mechanized units during Ukraine's successful push to retake Kherson, though their exact impact remains unclear. There will be a lot of stories like after the war, I'm pretty sure, so it's time will tell. In 2023 and 24, they got integrated into regular brigades like 60th Mechanized Brigade operations. And Colombian veterans preferred integration into regular Ukrainian units over the International Legion. They contributed to defensive operations in Donetsk and Zaporizhia, particularly in trench warfare and reconnaissance. 98th Territorial Defense Battalion, at its peak, Colombians comprised 25% of one company. 20 fighters out of 80 were Colombians, and they were noted for sharing shifts to relieve Ukrainian troops, but began departing en masse by late 2024 due to deteriorating conditions. Also, by early 2025, most Colombian fighters had left Ukraine after completing or prematurely ending their 6-month contracts. A company commander in the 98th Battalion confirmed 0 remaining Colombians in his unit. Heavy casualties, harsh frontline conditions, and waning morale were cited. Some veterans, like quotation mark Kaminsky, I guess that's his nom de guerre, returned for multiple tours, but retention rates plummeted. The Bolivar Battalion, a multinational Latin American group, included Colombians but was less prominent than direct integration into Ukrainian forces. I believe this is not the last time I will analyze foreign troops in Ukraine, but for now, I believe I gave you some very basic information about the situation on the ground in Ukraine when it comes to Colombian and Latin forces in general. I hope each one of them come home to their families in one piece, and alive, and for the occupation of the Ukraine, I really wish to be over. Okay, so I'm done with that serious Bravos Colombianos. Now it's Colombia fun time, so I'm switching to music. It's Carol G and Manuel Turizo. Hasta la próxima, sé selectivo. Ciao.